Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're digging into something absolutely fundamental, yet often invisible, the software interface.
Right. It's more than just code connecting. It's the hidden architecture, the set of rules that dictate how different parts of a system actually talk to each other.
And when that communication breaks down, well, the results can be dramatic.
Oh, absolutely. Think about the Mars Climate Orbiter back in 1999. A $125 million mission lost.
Just staggering. And why?
A translation error, basically,
Yeah.
right at the interface boundary. One team was working in English units, inches, pounds. The navigation team, they were using metric, millimeters, meters.
So the commands being sent,
Yeah.
they were just fundamentally misunderstood by the spacecraft.
Exactly. It ended up hitting Mars instead of orbiting it.
Yeah.
Literally lost in translation because the interface wasn't consistent.
Wow. Okay, so that's our mission for this deep dive then. Really understanding these interfaces, how we need to design them, document them, manage them correctly so systems can actually cooperate.
Precisely. So let's start with the basics. What is a software interface? At its core, it's a boundary. It's where different elements meet and interact. And it sort of controls what gets in and out, right? Protects the internal workings. Yes, exactly. It's the gatekeeper, and the things interacting across that boundary, other software elements, users, maybe external systems, those are called actors.
The collection of all those actors is the element's environment.
Right. And this idea has three really important implications according to the source material. First off, every element in a system has to have an interface. Otherwise, why is it there? It can't do anything useful on its own.
Makes sense. What's the second one?
This one's key. Interfaces are two-way. We always think about what an element provides, like its methods or functions.
Yeah.
But the interface also defines what the element requires from its environment to work properly. Maybe it needs a certain amount of memory or expects another service to be available.
Ah, I see. So if the environment doesn't deliver on those requirements, the element can fail, even if its own code is perfect.
Precisely. It flips the responsibility, doesn't it? And third, one element can interact with lots of actors through the same interface simultaneously. Think of a web server handling multiple users at once.
Okay, and getting this interface design right, it affects basically everything. Modifiability, testing, performance.
Everything. It's foundational. It has this huge, outsized impact on the system's overall quality.
So we've got the boundary, the actors, the environment. Let's look to the interaction points themselves. The sources talk about resources. What are those?
Resources are the specific things you interact with at the interface, like a remote procedure call or a data stream. They're the concrete touch points.
And the text immediately splits resource into two aspects, syntax and semantics. Why that distinction?
Good question. They serve different roles. The syntax is, well, it's the grammar, the signature of a function, its name, the types of arguments it takes, everything you need to just write code that compiles or runs without an immediate syntax error.
Okay, that seems straightforward enough.
It usually is. But the semantics, that's the meaning. What actually happens when you use that resource?
So not just how to call it, but what it does.
Exactly. Does it change some internal state? Does it trigger an event? Does it have side effects? Does it affect how other resources might behave later? In some systems, like embedded ones, it even defines results you can physically see. Semantics is the real contract.
Got it. And we typically provide these resources through three main building blocks: operations, events, and properties.
That's right. Operations are probably the most familiar. You invoke them, they do something, maybe return a result. Think of a function call. And crucially, if they fail, the interface needs a clear way to signal that exceptions, maybe specific error codes.
Okay, then events.
Events are usually asynchronous. Something happens inside the element and it sends out a notification. Or maybe an event comes in, like receiving a message. It's less about direct request response.
And the third one, properties.
Yeah.
This sounds like metadata. And this brings us back to Mars, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Properties are data transferred via operations or events, but they define context, access rights, maybe formatting rules, and critically, units of measure. If the semantics of an operation depends on a property, like assuming input is in meters, but the property is actually set to feet. The syntax is fine, the call works, but the result, catastrophic. Like the Mars orbiter, that was a property mismatch failure.
Wow. Just a tiny piece of metadata causing such a huge problem.
Yeah.
So the interface is this critical contract. How do we change it over time? Because software does change.
It does, but you have to be really careful. Unlike the internal code, which you can refactor freely, changing the interface breaks things for everyone using it. There are basically three ways to handle it.
Okay.
One is deprecation. You mark an interface as obsolete, give people notice, and eventually remove it. The problem is people often don't notice until their stuff breaks months later.
Yeah, I can see that happening. What else?
A safer route is versioning. You keep the old interface running, but introduce a new improved version, V2, V3, whatever. Clients then have to explicitly say which version they want to use.
More work, but less likely to break things immediately.
Right. And the third way is extension. You leave the original interface alone and just add new resources, new capabilities.
But what if adding something new creates a conflict? Like, say, your old interface just took an address string, but now internally you want separate fields for street, city, apartment number. The new internal structure doesn't match the old external call anymore.
That's a perfect scenario for the mediator pattern. Think of it like a translator. The mediator sits between the outside world, using the old address string, and your internal system, which now expects separate fields. It takes the old format and translates it into the new format for the internal component.
So it bridges the gap, keeps the contract intact for older clients while allowing the internals to evolve.
Exactly. It maintains compatibility.
Okay, so when we're designing these interfaces, these contracts, what principles should guide us? The sources say adding a resource is a commitment.
It absolutely is. Breaking that commitment later is painful. The first principle is probably the most important. The principle of least surprise.
Meaning?
Meaning the interface should behave the way actors expect it to. If an operation is called calculate interest, it shouldn't, also format the user's hard drive. Good naming is crucial here.
Makes sense. Don't surprise people in nasty ways.
Yeah.
What else?
The small interfaces principle. Keep the interaction minimal. Exchange only the information that's absolutely necessary. Less data crossing the boundary means less coupling, less complexity.
Okay, keep it focused.
Then there's the uniform access principle. This means hiding implementation details. The caller shouldn't need to know if the data they requested came from a cache, was calculated live, or fetched from a database. It should look the same.
Right, abstract.
Exactly. And finally, the don't repeat yourself principle, or DRY, offer basic, composable building blocks rather than having 5 different ways to achieve roughly the same outcome.
And underlying all of this is consistency, right? Same naming style, same way of handling errors everywhere.
Absolutely critical. Consistency across all interfaces in your system reduces the cognitive load on developers and minimizes errors caused by misunderstanding how a specific interface works.
So those are principles for the interface itself. But the sources also talk about 4 key agreements needed for a successful interaction. Interface scope, interaction style, data representation, and error handling. Let's take scope first.
Interface scope is about defining which resources are actually available to a particular actor. You might not expose everything, maybe for security reasons or performance, or just to keep things simpler for certain users.
And sometimes the elements providing the resources might be complex or numerous or change often. Is there a pattern for managing that?
Yes, the gateway pattern. Think of it as a single front door or intermediary. An actor sends a request to the gateway, and the gateway figures out which internal element or elements need to handle it.
Ah, like a reverse proxy sometimes.
Sort of, yeah. It can translate requests, maybe combine results from multiple internal elements, restrict access, or provide a stable entry point even if the internal elements change their location or protocol. Very useful.
Okay, next agreement. Interaction style. This seems to range from tightly coupled systems to distributed ones. The big players mentioned are RPC and REST.
Right. RPC, remote procedure call, tries to make calling a function on a remote machine look just like calling a local one.
I remember older versions being kind of clunky.
They could be. Early RPC was often synchronous, text-based, but it's evolved hugely. Today you have things like gRPC from Google. It's binary, super fast, supports asynchronous calls, streaming, built-in authentication, runs over HTTP 2.0. Really high performance.
And the other big one is REST, Representational State Transfer. That's the foundation of most web services, isn't it?
It is. REST isn't a specific technology. It's an architectural style based on 6 constraints.
Okay, what are they?
First, a uniform interface, usually meaning standard HTTP methods like get, post, put, delete, using URIs to identify resources. Second, client-server architecture, clear separation of concerns.
Right.
Third, and this is crucial for scaling, statelessness. The server doesn't remember anything about the client between requests. All necessary state, like authentication, has to be sent with each request.
That's why we have things like session tokens or JWT.
Exactly. Fourth, cacheable. Responses should indicate if they can be cached to improve performance. Fifth, tiered system. The server itself might be composed of multiple layers, web server, application logic, database, but the client only talks to one intermediary layer.
And the last one.
Code on demand. This is optional, but allows the server to send executable code like JavaScript to the client.
And those standard HTTP methods you mentioned, get, post, put, delete, they map pretty neatly to database operations, right?
They do. It's often aligned with CRED, create, post, read, GT, update, putty or patch cut usually replaces, patch change modifies, and delete. Delete. It gives a common language for interacting with resources over the web.
Okay, so we have the style, like REST or RPC. Now, how do we actually format the data being sent back and forth? That's the data representation agreement, serialization.
Right, serialization or marshalling. Taking your internal program, data object, structures, whatever, and turning it into a stream of bytes you can send over a network and then turning it back again on the other side.
What do we need to consider when picking a format?
Several things. How expressive is it? Can it represent complex data? Interoperability. Can different languages easily use it? Performance. How fast is it to serialize and deserialize? How big is the data? Does it create implicit coupling? And transparency. Can a human actually read it?
That last one, transparency, sounds like a double-edged sword. Good for debugging, maybe bad for security.
Exactly. So let's look at the big three formats mentioned. First, XML.
XML, the old workhorse.
Yeah, textual, very structured with tags and attributes, standardized way back in '98. Its big strength is schema validation. You can define the expected structure very precisely and reject invalid documents.
But a downside.
It's verbose, really verbose, lots of angle brackets. And parsing and validating it can be computationally expensive. You often have to read the whole thing to make sense of it.
Okay. Then came JSON.
JSON JavaScript Object Notation. Also textual, but much lighter weight. Uses simple name-value pairs and arrays. It's generally much faster to parse, often as you read it, and very efficient for web APIs. It's kind of the default now for many REST services.
Less formal validation than XML schemas, though.
Typically, yes, although schema definitions for JSON exist. And the third option, binary, right, like protocol buffers from Google. Because it's binary, not text, it's incredibly compact and efficient. Uses way less bandwidth and memory.
How does it work?
You define the data structure in a special .proto file. Then you use a compiler to generate code in your target language. Java, Python, C++, whatever, to handle serialization and deserialization. Very fast, language independent, often paired with gRPC.
So XML for structure and validation, right. JSON for web API simplicity and speed, protocol buffers for maximum efficiency.
That's a decent summary, yeah. Trade-offs for each.
Okay, the final agreement. Error handling. Things will go wrong.
Absolutely. A robust interface must anticipate failure. Invalid input, network glitches, running out of memory, the element being in the wrong state.
Like trying to write to a file that isn't open.
Exactly. Or hardware failures, or even just incorrect configuration, like a bad database password. The interface needs strategies for dealing with this.
What kind of strategies?
Well, exceptions are common in many languages. Status indicators returning specific error codes. Sometimes you might set a property on the object to indicate success or failure. For asynchronous things like timeouts, you might use error events, or just writing detailed logs to an error stream.
And it's important to know the source of the error, right?
Crucial. Knowing why it failed helps the system decide what to do. Is it a temporary network blip? Okay, maybe retry. Is the input totally invalid? Tell the caller to fix their request. Is a required component missing? That might need human intervention.
Makes sense. You can't recover if you don't know what broke. So we've designed the interface, chosen the style, the data format, the error handling. Now we need to document it.
Right. And the key point here is that the interface is everything another element can observe, including things like how fast it responds. The documentation is a subset of that. It's the formal promise, the contract, of what actors can reliably depend on.
But there's a catch, isn't there? Something called Hiram's Law.
Ah, yes. Hiram's Law. It's a bit cynical, but often true. With a sufficient number of users of an interface, it does not matter what you promise in the contract. All observable behaviors of your system will be depended on by somebody.
Meaning, even if you didn't intend for that super fast response time to be a guarantee, if users see it, they might build systems that rely on it. And if you later slow it down,
You break their system. Even though you technically didn't violate your documented contract, it's a tough reality of evolving large systems.
so documentation is critical, but you also have to be aware of these implicit dependencies. And different people need different things from the documentation, right?
Definitely. The developer using the interface needs the basics: how to call operations, what data to expect. The developer implementing it needs the requirements side, too. Testers need error conditions. A performance analyst needs guarantees about speed or resource usage, service level agreements, or SLAs. The architect might be looking at reusability or how it affects overall system qualities.
So designing and documenting interfaces,
Mhm.
it's a huge part of architecture.
It's arguably one of the most important parts. It defines how the pieces fit together, how they communicate, how the system behaves as a whole.
Okay, so recapping. Interfaces are these critical boundaries. Designing them well means thinking about the scope, the interaction style like RPC or REST the data format, XML, JSON, protocol buffers, and definitely robust error handling.
And that interface documentation is the formal contract, the promise of syntax and semantics. But we also have to remember Hiram's law and the implicit dependencies that can form.
We saw how fragile that contract can be, how even a simple units mismatch cost $125 million at the Mars orbiter. And we know interfaces evolve through things like deprecation, versioning, or extension, sometimes needing mediators.
It all comes back to managing that boundary carefully.
So the final thought we want to leave you with is this. Think about a piece of software that's really frustrated you recently. Was that frustration maybe caused by a violation of that principle of least surprise? Did it do something unexpected and damaging?
Or perhaps it was a failure in error handling. Did it just crash or give you a useless error message, leaving you totally stuck with no way to figure out what went wrong or how to fix it? Understanding these interface breakdowns is often the key to understanding software failures.
Understanding that boundary, that contract, is just essential if you want to build systems that work reliably and don't deliver catastrophic surprises.
Well said.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into software interfaces. We'll see you next time.